ultimately, this is a story about a classically trained composer, arranger, band leader who becomes, as I said, sort of an ambassador for Latin music to the wider world, helping to popularize the mixing of these different styles of music, jazz harmony ideas with Latin rhythms. So, who is this guy? Tito Puente. He's born Ernest Anthony Puente Jr., better known as Tito, April 20th, 1923, in Harlem, New York City, Spanish Harlem, to be specific. His parents are from Puerto Rico. And now I have to say that even that detail was surprising to me because I always assumed he was Cuban, knowing
Same
basically.
here. Same. I thought he was Cuban, born in Cuba.
Yeah.
You know.
Known as the King of Mambo, as I alluded to in my tweet, it's a traditionally Cuban style. And he's so associated with Cuban music that when the government of Cuba hosted a 50 years of Cuban music celebration in the 50s, Tito was the only non-Cuban invited to participate in that celebration. So his proper name is Ernest, as we mentioned, but as a kid they called him Ernestito, which is like Little Ernest, and that got shortened to Tito. And a little bit about the place he comes from. Spanish Harlem in the 30s and 40s, or even in the 20s when he's born, it's this melting pot of immigrants, of musical styles. You got people from all over Latin America, Cubans, of course, Puerto Ricans, but people from all over the Caribbean. And it's this little pocket of Harlem. It's in east of Harlem, east of the where the Harlem Renaissance, let's say, is going on, right? So they start calling it Spanish Harlem. And keep in mind that Cuba at this time was still completely open to Americans. So people are going back and forth a lot. You can actually tune in Cuban radio stations in New York if you choose to. Then there's this really rich musical tradition going on there, which is starting to be called Afro-Cuban. And it includes this genre that is sometimes called mambo.
That's like kind of around, that's maybe a little bit before when like the mafia was trying to get into Cuba. I feel like that was a big thing that they were doing in the 50s, trying to take advantage of the Cuban market because it was a big market for American tourists to go down there because it's so close, it's beautiful, and it was, like I said, very open at the time. Being run by a government that was being propped up by the Americans and was, I'm sure, not super great to the people.
Yeah, totally. And I don't know a ton about the history of Cuba, unsurprisingly, nor is this podcast the place to go deep into it. But suffice to say that Cuba and America had a much better relationship at that time. And like you said, tourists were going back and forth, cultural exchange was happening, and people were going back and forth quite a bit. So, in addition to that, as I mentioned, very close by, you've got the Harlem Renaissance going on, which we've talked about in previous episodes. It's this time in the 30s into the 40s where the big band era of jazz, the kind of Duke Ellington, Count Basie era of jazz, huge bands, is shifting towards small bands in small clubs, this kind of fast-paced bebop, highly technical. So there's a lot happening, and there will eventually be some cross-pollination here. They talk about how, actually, I should say, before we go any further, I was blown away by how challenging it was to research this week's topic. I really had to dig deep. I was looking for a English language biography of Tito Puente. I could not find one, and there's not a lot of information on this album, so we're gonna cobble stuff together.
Though he
Apocryphal.
though he does he was not shy
Uh,
to be interviewed on any sort of media, Sesame Street, Charlie Rose show. He's all over the place in that regard.
I also feel like, Rob, you're doing it a little wrong when you say his name is Tito Puente. I feel like you have to say his name is Tito Puente. Like it's got like a pizzazz to him.
He definitely loves to talk, and so I did listen to several interviews with him. However, because he's had such a long career and he's released so much music, and we're going to get to that, it was a little hard to find specific information about this time and this period. Also, I think the subject matter we're dealing with, in part because it's fairly alien to me, I'm going to take some digressions here to try to explain a little bit about what was going on, how the style came to be, and why it's important to the style overall. But okay, let's talk about some of the details of Tito's life. He takes to music really early. There's a story about when he's about 7 years old. All the neighbors in the apartment building are complaining because he's making way too much noise. He's constantly banging on pots and pans, rhythms, banging. So his mother, in response, decides to send him to piano lessons, of course. I also read somewhere that he actually got a chance to see a big Latin band around this time, this guy called Machito, when he was a young kid. And Machito's going to figure into the story a little later as well. And that seeing him really influenced his musical path. But honestly, that might be apocryphal. I only saw that one place because when I dug into Machito a little bit, he's a Cuban who didn't make it to New York until the late 30s. He's about 20 years older than Tito. And like I said, Tito will eventually play in his band and figure into this story. But that's after the time when Tito would have already started playing music.
Hmm.
So
I like how, Rob, you sort of were like setting it up like all he wants to do is play the drums, and then his parents get him piano lessons, like womp womp. What kind of
Right.
fucking sociopath lives in an apartment building and gets their kid a drum set? Like that would just have been the least neighborly thing in the world to do. I don't know why anyone would get their kids into the drums at all.
I
It's
feel like you get the kid a bucket and you say, go to the park, bro. Because that's
Yeah, right.
yeah, that's free. You might even make a little money doing that.
what I'm saying. So, okay, because Machito is kind of the predecessor of Tito and becomes sort of a mentor to him, let's take a quick digression to his journey. So he's a band leader. Like I said, he's 20 years older approximately than Tito. He is born and raised in Havana, Cuba. He comes to New York and he forms a band called the Afro-Cubans, which, to the best of my understanding, admittedly limited, might be the coining of that term in regards to music at that time.
Hmm.
So they're truly the first wave of bands that are blending this thing called an African clave rhythm with some of the concepts of jazz harmony. But to be honest, if you listen to some of that stuff, it's much more staid and traditional sounding than the Tito stuff. It's much less party music. Now, although these movements are all starting to pop off around the same time, like I said, Harlem and Spanish Harlem are relatively close by geographically, obviously. But because of racial lines, it is taking a fair amount of time to cross pollinate it, as you maybe can imagine, right? It eventually happens, but it takes time.
It is also kind of interesting that at the time of the Harlem Renaissance, they were getting away from the big band run by a band leader type of modality of music. And it sounds like the Afro-Cuban movement was very much big bands led by a band leader. So they're sort of kind of moving in opposite directions when it comes to the overall sort of theory of how to comprise a band. And that has always been a little strange to me, this concept of the band leader. Like, what do you play? Oh, actually, I don't really play all that much. I just kind of lead the band and I sort of tell everybody what to do, but I'm not even in most of the songs. I just am sort of the guy that put everybody
But
together.
I think you have to have. I mean, but I think you have to have a lot of music knowledge to be a
Oh,
band leader.
I'm sure
You
you
have
have
to
to
be
have a
able.
lot of chops, right? But you're not out there in front showing off your chops. You're kind of just orchestrating everything.
I don't feel like this music, one difference between what's going on in bebop on the Harlem side is that this music does not seem like it's about virtuosity or showing off nearly as much. So I also agree with what you said, Tom, that this is a little more large scale band oriented. But at the same time, I think both movements were about shaking up the status quo and meeting the community where they wanted to be met, right? On the Harlem side, you had these small clubs. It was easier for these small bars to get licenses, but they had small areas. And so you had these smaller and smaller bands, and you had people wanting to come and dance. And I think we've spoken before about, I always thought this is an interesting detail, but the whole concept of a solo in a song just came from the dancers on the dance floor wanting the most exciting part of the song to go on longer. And the
Hmm.
musicians were like, how do we keep playing? We can't just keep playing the melody. Oh, we just have to loop it and improvise over it. And that's sort of where that concept came from. And Tito is bringing some of those concepts of jazz improvisation into this style as well. Okay, but I wanted to mention a landmark. I thought this is an interesting historical landmark of the eventual cross pollination is by way of Dizzy Gillespie. He ends up collaborating with a different Cuban musician. This is a little later in 1947, but before this record comes out. And they make a song called Manteca or Mantica. And it's considered the first crossover between Latin music and jazz. And it's also the first standard, as in something in the real book of American standards, jazz standards, to be based on that clave rhythm. Now, as I looked a little closer at that song, Manteca, small side note is that Manteca, which in Spanish means butter or lard, was actually Cuban slang for heroin.
Ah,
Ah,
all right.
damn.
It all comes back to heroin.
So I was gonna say it's all coming together.
Fun little note. But okay, so at this point, Machito is the big name in the burgeoning Afro-Cuban scene by the time Tito is coming up. And at this point, we've been talking around this concept of Latin rhythms called clave. I feel we got to take another digression, just explain this term briefly. It literally in Spanish, it means code or key, as in the key to decoding a piece of music. But in practice, it refers to a rhythmic pattern originating in Africa. And there's a few different ones really that you hear all throughout Latin and even African music probably to this day. And the simple way to explain it is just to hear it. So I'm just going to say it out loud. But a super common clave rhythm goes like this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if you start playing that pattern over in your head over a record like this, you're going to kind of hear it everywhere. Now, of course, you could flip it around. There's variations on it, but it's a large part of what creates the distinctive feel of this particular kind of music. And it does fit the same 4 count that rock and roll uses. It just breaks the measures into different places and uses different emphasis.
Yeah, and it almost like is like it almost swings in a way due to there's that 4/5 oddness at the end of the phrase gives it a weird kind of funky, bouncy, swingy type feel.
Yeah, they're definitely they kind of rush beats, and it'll be like,
Yeah.
Like 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2. Little rush of those beats gives you a little thing to swing to. It's not like head noddy music, like that kind of hard 4 on the floor hip hop beat or something that's very on the beat. It's very playing around the beats.
And I think that's the best way to think about it, because you're right. To our Western ears, it feels like they're playing not right on the beat. They're jumping the beat a little bit consistently. But that's because we're so trained on 1, 2, 3, 4. Like you said, that's the beat in all hip hop songs. That's the beat in all disco songs. It's pretty much the beat in all rock and roll songs. This clave rhythm that I just described, more or less, is like the foundation for Latin music. So it's a big difference, and that's where that feel comes from in a large way. And yeah, okay, so like we're saying, it makes all the difference, right? So back to a young Tito Puente. When we last left him, he was 7. He's banging around on pots and pans. His mother sends him off to get piano lessons, and a few years of training later, he switches over to the drums, much to the chagrin of his apartment mates. But the world is never the same, which brings us to our favorite segment on the podcast. God damn it, it's our favorite segment. I don't care what anyone says. It's Tito Puente by the numbers. So, first number I want to throw out to you: 7, as in a 7-decade career. Now, Tito sadly passed away at the age of 73 in 2000, but he was touring and playing shows right up until his death from a heart attack. He had a heart attack after a show in Puerto Rico and then died the next day.
Oh, damn.
Next number I want to throw out to you is 6, as in the number of Grammys Tito Puente has won. Plus, in addition to that, he also won a posthumously awarded Lifetime Achievement Award. And these Grammys take place over multiple decades, which is kind of wild as well.
I think
He didn't get to do his the album where it's like him and Alicia Keys on a song, and then him and like
his Supernatural.
Right, yeah. He didn't have a chance to do a Supernatural. Maybe
Well,
he did.
I was gonna say that, listening to this album this week, I was definitely like, oh, that's who I can blame for Smooth. Okay. I see the lineage now.
We're gonna get there. And next number, perhaps the most impressive number, arguably, 100. As in, this man has over 100 albums released. His 100th album was released in 1991, and it is called Mambo King, because people in this musical style cannot deviate too far from titles, of course. And
Yeah.
I should mention, as I looked through his album names, he does have an album called Hot Timbales, which is what I named our focus list for the week before I looked through these. And lastly, I just want to get in my favorite album name of his has to be Mambo Rama.
There really is not a whole lot of difference in in these album titles. I mean, some of them are like 2 albums in a row, Latin Flight and Latin Kings, right in a row. It's like, come on, man, you just named one, Latin Flight. Just mix
Right.
it up a
It's
little
like
bit.
it's like Thai food restaurants in Portland, and I'm sure in San Francisco. It's like you have to have some funny, Thai pod or
Yeah, yeah.
kind of.
Indeed. And the last number I want to throw out to you guys is 13. That is the age at which Tito goes pro. That's right.
Damn.
He gets a job as a percussionist in a guy called Ramon Olivero's band at 13 years old. Can you imagine that? At 7, he's banging on pots and pans. And by 13, he's cashing a check and playing the clubs in New York City.
Damn. And he's not even
Yeah,
a bass player, which I could understand if you're like a 13-year-old bass player getting a gig in a band after a couple of lessons, but damn,
And
drummer's tough.
speaking of the myriad ways to have your kids learn too much too fast about the life and times of professional musicians, we absolutely love doing this show every week. We love diving into the stories, researching artists from all these decades and genres, and we do it for you, dear audience. Well, also for ourselves, but partially for you, dear audience. We are certainly sincerely grateful for all of you, and whether that means you listen every single Monday when the new episodes drop, or you're making your way slowly through the back catalog right now, or this is 3,000 years in the future, as Phil often likes to project, and the aliens have destroyed our civilization. You're shuffling through the ruins of our life and times. We appreciate it. Listening to the show alone is supporting us. But if you'd like to take things a step further, all you got to do is tell a friend or leave us a 5-star rating or go sign up for our Patreon, where every week for free we're having open discussions about the latest episode, plus allowing you to vote for albums you want to hear us cover on the show. And of course, for only $5 a month, we're making tons of fun bonus content like our latest release, Guilty Pleasures. We did 2 volumes of it recently, where we all selected music we love but feel a little uncool for liking, and let the ad hominem attacks of our closest friends ensue. Okay, back to our story. So Tito has success as a teenager, playing in the clubs around New York. And around the time he's 17 or 18, the percussionist in his hero Machito's band gets drafted to go fight in World War II. So a spot opens up. Tito gets hired. And by the way, by now he has made the switch over to timbales, being his main instrument, not the drums. Timbales, by the way, for Western music listeners, are like a set of tuned snare drums that players typically play while standing up. And they were originally developed as an alternate to timpanis, which is a classical music, a larger drum. That's where the name comes from. Timbales are shallow and they're tuned up quite high. And sometimes you'll also see other percussion instruments attached, like a cowbell or something. And also, just for word fun, the person who plays the timbales is called a timbalero, which is a great.
I like how one of the hallmarks of this music style is just like the most aggressive forms of all of the instruments in terms of like timbre. It's like we want trumpets, we want timbales, which is essentially just a snare drum. It's all just going to come right at you, like. And
a cowbell.
And a cowbell. Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
These are aggressive sounds for sure.
Aggressive sounds. And I felt it this week, definitely.
Yeah.
So we alluded to it, but in case you can't tell from the interviews or from his Simpsons cameo, Tito is a real showman. He's a very outgoing stage persona, which is kind of interesting because by all accounts, he was a bit of a shy kid. So it sounds like music really helped him open up. And to be honest, just hearing him talk is infectious, as I think I already mentioned. He's got a ton of energy. He truly loves music, and he loves its power to help people enjoy life. That's really his goal in life. But interestingly, at the time, well, perhaps still, drummers were always placed in the back. And really, it's where they should be. But Tito is such a force of nature, so flamboyant playing his timbales, that they move him up front, and he kind of becomes the star of the show real fast. And then, just as everything's happening for this young man, guess what happens? He gets drafted to go fight in World War II. He goes over, he ends up serving in the Navy on a Navy ship for a couple of years, doing his civic duty proudly. And when he comes back, of course, he's very, very excited to get back to music. But when
Just quick question on the naval thing. Do you know if he was in the Pacific or if he was in the Atlantic
I don't,
theater?
I don't think he saw combat. I'm not 100% sure.
Okay. Because
Yeah.
I saw
I
that
think he was. I think he was out in the Pacific because there's a song that kind of maybe references his time there that we're going to talk about a little bit.
I didn't look too deep into it. He was on a ship called the U.S. Santee. You could probably look up what that was doing in World War II.
Yeah. I just was thinking about it because having watched I watched that Masters of the Air show recently, where it's about the airmen that were flying over Europe, but they're based in England. And they had a band, and that band is just like hanging out in England, playing along. But when you're in the Navy, you're like on the ship that's getting bombed and, having the kamikaze fighters come in. So they're like, yeah, he played the saxophone and the piano, and he had to man the machine guns during an attack. I'm like, should have gone into the Air Force, man. Those guys had it easy. They were just basically like mechanics who got to play in bands on the weekends.
There's got to be a Navy band too, though, right? I assume.
Oh, he was. He was in the Navy band.
He was in the Navy band, but I think
Yeah.
because you're on the ship, they're like, you also have to do a bunch of other shit, like, and get bombed and stuff like that.
Sure, fair enough. So he finishes his service to his country. He comes home, and at first he tries to head right back to his job in Machito's band because there's supposedly a guarantee that you can come back and get your job after the war because he got drafted. Unfortunately, the guy who replaced him apparently had 6 kids, and Machito's like, I can't fire this guy, Tito. Come on. You don't have any kids. Like, give me a break, right?
Machito's HR department didn't handle that one particularly well. They didn't follow the letter of the law. I'm going to guess
there's like
W2'd.
Yeah, I imagine there's like 65 people in the band. Just come on, just move some guys around,
37 of them play trumpet.
So. Right,
Yeah.
right, that's true. Yeah.
Like you're above 2 timbale players, Machito. Come on.
But it ends up, he turns that little bit of misfortune into what turns out to be an excellent career decision because he leverages the GI Bill to attend Juilliard, the prestigious music school, where he studies orchestration, arrangement, and composition for a full 3 years and graduates. And from there, he puts together his own band, the Tito Puente Orchestra. So this is post-war New York. There's a celebratory culture happening. There's this particular club downtown called the Palladium that becomes ground zero for this Latin movement. There's nights where Tito's band is playing a set, then Machito's band is playing a set. The house is packed even on a weeknight. People are loving it. They're dancing. And this same kind of like celebratory renewal of music is happening uptown. We've talked about it in previous episodes in the Harlem jazz clubs where Miles Davis and John Coltrane and Monk are gigging every night. So it's kind of a very cool time, right, to be in New York. People are loving music. They're loving going out and celebrating. Now, as I mentioned, ultimately what Tito did was he merged Latin ideas with big band jazz arrangements, or perhaps for the first time, arguably, or at least at a very, very early time. He was being influenced by a lot of that jazz that was happening uptown. Plus, he had this strong orchestration and compositional chops that not a lot of Latin players necessarily had that pulls all of this together. And lastly, of course, he had this big winning personality, right? That was larger than life, and it made him this ideal ambassador and band leader for this cultural movement that was happening. You get these jazz arrangements, you get improvisation borrowed from jazz, and you mix it with these Latin rhythmic ideas and instrumentation ideas. And pretty quickly, because he has a band together and because he's got such a winning personality and because he's got the chops, word starts to get around that for arranging Latin music, Tito is your guy. And we have alluded to it already, but in addition to timbales, remember, and he's considered a virtuoso on the timbales. Take that as you will, but that is his primary instrument, and he is considered the best of the best. But keep in mind, he also plays piano, vibraphone, marimba. I think that both of those instruments appear of him playing on this record. Saxophone, congas, and the regular drum kit, although Marty was unable to find any of the scrubbed images from the internet. So this era of Latin music is building over several years, but there is a little bit of a Latin, like Caribbean craze in America in the early 50s. Think Harry Belafonte's Calypso material, or I was even thinking about the success of Desi Arnaz of I Love Lucy,
Hmm.
Lucy's husband, and he's a Cuban-born musician with a production company who has a successful sitcom on TV, and his music career is a big part of the show, frankly, and
Yeah.
even some successful hit songs.
I remember as a kid being at like my nana's house and watching old I Love Lucy reruns and being like, his job is a band leader? Like, that's not a job. How is that you like that was just accepted that they're like, oh yeah, and he's a Latin band leader. That's just there's tons of them. There, you run into them on every street corner. But
Yeah.
apparently, I guess it was a thing.
It was definitely a thing. I believe someone could fact check me. I believe Desi Arnaz's big hit was Cuban Pete, which I also know from The Mask.
Oh yeah.
But in any case, now we're kind of at the time where Dance Mania Volume 1. I can't quite tell if Volume 1 was applied to later releases or something because they just couldn't think of more album titles, but Dance Mania or Dance
There,
Mania Volume 1.
but there's no volume 2.
There is no Volume 2 that I can find. That's why
Yeah. That's odd.
he was just anticipating not wanting to come up with a title. Anyway, this comes out. This is Tito's 11th album release already, but it's by far his most successful. It sells big at the time. It comes out in August of 1958 on RCA Records, a major label. I even heard some sources saying that the original release is the first major label release with Latin rhythms throughout. Now, that claim was very difficult to verify. I'm not sure if it is verifiable, but it's certainly very early on, and it's one of the early successes of this music to the masses. I should also mention that Tito Puente is estimated to have sold. I couldn't get great sales data for the records specifically because I guess we didn't keep great sales records at the time. But it was definitely a hit at the time, like I said, and it's touted as his most successful record. Now, I did get some information, some stats on Tito Puente's entire career. He's estimated to have sold over 10 million albums over the course of his career. That's 10.
That's like 100,000 per album, right?
Yeah, I was gonna say that's not a lot.
Flood the market, baby. But Dance Mania specifically has had several reissues over the years, including several in the 21st century. Now, that's Dance Mania. We're going to talk about the songs in a moment, but I would be remiss if I didn't flash ahead a couple more years to a song that isn't on this album at all, but it is Tito's biggest hit and the track that continues to pay his estate to this day. It's called Oye Como Va. Released originally in 1962, but more importantly, covered by one Carlos Santana in 1970. So in a way, Tito Puente is responsible not just for Smooth, Tom, but for all of Santana's career.
All of Santana's career. Well, listen, I like Soul Sacrifice. Good on you, Tito. I'm not exactly super happy about Evil Ways or anything like that, but whatever.
Did Santana write Evil Ways? Because I was thinking Santana also did not write Black Magic Woman. And of course, we know that a professional songwriter, wrote Smooth. So he really has ridden a wave of cover songs for his entire career.
Actually, yeah, it's a Sonny Henry song, Evil Ways. So, good
Yeah.
Lord. God damn, Santana, get your shit together. You're not even singing on the albums. You're just like a guitar player in a cover band who somehow turned yourself into a household name.
So just because Oye Como Va is such a popular song, I thought I would mention, I never took notice of this, but the lyrics are Oye Como Va mi ritmo, and that is Spanish for listen how it goes, my rhythm. But clearly they're referencing, like you said, they don't have a lot of lyrical content in this musical style. They're talking about dancing, they're talking about rhythm, and they're talking about love. That's pretty much it. I did, though, interesting enough, hear Tito say that he was getting 6-figure monthly royalty checks at one point for this tune.
Jeez.
And that's in the 70s. 6 figures in the 70s.
Presumably, he did not clarify, but I think it has paid him a lot of money over the years.
Good for him.
Because that Santana song is pretty ubiquitous. We must agree, right?
Oh yeah.
But okay, back to Dance Mania from 1958. One more interesting tidbit is it's an early example of stereo sound on a vinyl record. You can actually see on the cover, even on Spotify, how excited they are about stereo. It's proudly displayed. And on the original vinyl press, I just saw photographs of it that someone posted online, but the record sleeve has a long-winded description of what stereo sound even is. and it's entitled "What is Stereophonic Sound?" And they're spending a whole album side's worth of text explaining the technology of stereo and why, because of the nature of our biology and our 2 ears, this is actually better. So they're like really having to convince you that this is a thing. But it's an interesting early exercise in stereo, three-dimensional listening.
Living stereo is what it says, which is kind of weird.
And speaking of the listening experience, shall we dive into the songs, boys?
Let's do it.